Alright guys, welcome back to the Crest series, and now we need to talk about render layers. So render layers are probably one of my favorite things to talk about when I'm teaching compositing because it allows you so much control in post. So much like AOVs that allow you to separate different aspects of your render, for example, your specular highlights, your reflections and shadows, and far more control than that, what render layers allow you to do is separate your scene physically by geometry or lights. So what that means is you could, for example, set up your scene so you have your hero ship model, but you might have two of them and you don't really know which one you want to use yet, or the client doesn't know which one they use. And you have a background layer and maybe some environments or rocks or something. And what that allows you to do is, first of all, gives you far more control in your composition. So you don't have to rely on things like Cryptomatte to select different pieces of geometry just from a matte. It allows you a physical layer to deal with. And more importantly, in my opinion, is that it allows you to render only the parts that you need with specific render settings for those objects. For example, if you know a background is going to be completely out of focus, there's no need to spend time rendering it with really high anti-aliasing or a lot of really sharp detail. It doesn't really matter because it's going to be completely out of focus. In fact, you can just turn on a denoiser and render that part of the sequence very quickly. It also would allow you, if you make a mistake on something like the ship, you can just render out the ship again. Now there are some limitations and you do need to be mindful of how you set up render layers, but in this video I want to give you an overview of the concept of render layers so you can begin to apply those to your own scenes. We're also going to be going over some basic compositing with these render layers and our AOVs. So if you haven't already, make sure you have the OpenColor.io plugin installed because you need to make sure that After Effects is ready to handle your ACEScg renders. Otherwise, they're not going to look the same. All right, let's get started. Okay, so next the goal is I want to separate the ship from the clouds from the background. So with passes, we can separate elements of a specific layer or specific scene just based on the properties of the shader and how lights are reacting with it and other utilities. But if we want to physically separate objects, we use what is called a render layer. So render layers in Maya are accessible in this window here. It's like a clapperboard with a layer. It's going to be render setup is what this window is called. So render setup is something that I usually dock right here. And of course, this does kind of reduce your viewport, but I use this all the time. So I like to have that right here. And then for outliner, what I usually do, I click and drag this off, and then I dock it underneath one of these. So it's like this. And this is kind of finicky, but this is the easiest way to do it. Then you take your property editor, take that off, drag that on right here. So then your render setup stays together and your outliner stays together. You don't have to do that, but that's how you get this type of view. And I think this is going to be easier than having that as a floating window. So render layers in Maya are incredibly useful and is one of the most powerful systems that I've ever seen in a DCC. 3ds Max doesn't have anything even remotely like this. Lightwave doesn't have anything like this. And Maya is really good. I've just started learning Houdini, which has like a take system, which is a little bit similar, I think. Or if you've ever used Cinema 4D, I think it has something similar. And it makes Maya really powerful. Hopefully other DCCs get something like this too, because it's really hard going from Maya to other things without a render setup. Anyway, so what we have right here is what is considered our master layer or our default layer. And that is displayed right here as your scene. Then we get a little visibility, or this is whatever you're selecting. And then a clapperboard icon, which says, hey, do you want this to actually render if we batch this? If you're using the PLE, you actually can't do any batch rendering, but at school, we have the full version of vray and you can batch render. So I'll show you that when we start doing the project, but for right now, we don't need to worry about this at all. But usually, you disable this because you never actually want to render your master layer. Your master layer is where you do all your setup. So everything is visible here and you're just you're importing stuff, you're playing around with lighting and stuff. But when it comes time to render, or you want to extract different objects and change different settings, then you start creating new layers. So the render setup is going to use the term AOVs, not render passes or render elements. Just bear that in mind. And by default, any type of light that you have in your scene will always affect every single layer. So just bear that in mind as well. So the first thing that I want to do is that I want to have this ship on its own layer. So what I do is click this little button here, and this creates a new render layer. And then I can just type in Razor Crest, or you could call it ship or something like that. And when you create a layer, it doesn't actually do anything. And if you were to click on the eye, you can now see the layer is like empty. The only thing it has in it is the sun. So we go back to our master layer here by clicking the eye. We right click over this, then we create a collection. So a render layer can have any number of collections. And later on, we'll go into a little bit more depth of what you can do with collections. Right now, we just want to simply add geometry to a collection. I'm going to pull this window out a little bit so we can see all of the buttons on the side. And we don't need to name the collection. We can just leave it collection 1. That's fine. If we wanted to say ship, that's fine too. But we really only need one collection for this, so we can just leave it at the default. Okay, so next I want to select the ship. But because the ship is in a group, I either have to go up to the hierarchy mode here and then select it, or I can go back to object mode and then simply have the group selected down here in the outliner. And you can middle mouse click and drag from the outliner into this little include window like this, or you can just click on add. And by default, all of your collections are going to be what's called a transform. So these are going to be basically just geometry that's attached to a transform node. So a transform node allows you to kind of move it around. So these are usually considered transforms. So now if I select the eye, it's only showing us the ship, which is really, really useful. Okay, so I'm going to create another one, and this one's going to be for clouds. Type in clouds, right click, create a collection. I'm just going to leave that as collection 2. I'm going to select all of these V-Ray volume grids. These are the clouds. And then I'm going to add them. The next, when I go back here, it's now added all of the clouds. And since the clouds are essentially in the background and they never go in front of our ship, it's very easy just to have all the clouds as a separated asset. So later on, we'll talk about what you do if you have like the Razor Crest going from behind a cloud, because that does change how you set up your render layers a little bit. But it's possible to do and is very, very common to do as well. Okay, so now we have Razor Crest, now we have the clouds, and the last thing we need is simply the sky. So for this, we're just going to create a blank render layer and just type in sky. So that is just going to be just the sky right there. Okay, so let's go to IPR. If we render just the sky, there's nothing there, just the sky and our horizon. If I go to clouds, I do have to stop the IPR, and by default, it should stop, but sometimes it won't, so it's always safer to stop it first. We can start here, and now we're only getting the clouds. And if we go just to the Razor Crest, we just get the Razor Crest. But now the problem is we actually have the sky in every single layer, which is not what we want. We want to be able to have just the ship, just the clouds, and then the sky by itself. But there's a solution to that, and that is what is called an override. So anytime that you have any type of render layer in Maya, you can use what is called an override to change a specific setting on that layer, but in the master layer, it's going to be whatever it was before, whatever the default state was. So let's do this on the Razor Crest first. So on this layer, minimize that. I can go up to Render Settings, go to Overrides, go to Environment, and we have this background texture. So if we click on the input connection to this, we can see that is the V-Ray sky. But I don't want to break this connection, because if I break the connection, then on every single layer, we're going to get rid of the sky. So even our sky layer is not going to have it anymore. But what we can do, we can right click over where it says background texture, and then click Create Absolute Override for Visible Layer. So when we do that, the channel turns orange to say that we've changed something. If we look in the Razor Crest layer here, we can see that Render Settings has an override on it. And now that it is overridden, we can change it. So we can select where it's gray and then just say, hey, we just want that to be black. So then we can go back to our IPR. And now you can see that the sky is gone. But we still have an alpha channel, so that's what we need. And next, if we go back to our sky layer, we can see that the background texture is not overridden. Go back to IPR, and then we still have our sky. So that's a really, really useful use of an override. So next we can do the same thing for clouds. So I can go back to the clouds layer, right click over background texture, create absolute override for visible layer, click on the swatch, say it's black, and then an override is being created. Go to IPR, and now you can see that there's no sky. So once again, Razor Crest has no sky, the cloud says no sky, and if we go to the sky layer itself, the sky is there. And it's useful to keep the sky layer on for your master layer as well. So when we select that, the sky is visible there. So the way that this works is that any additional layer that you create mimics the master layer, and any changes that you make on those layers, if you don't create an override, will affect all layers. If you want to change something, but only on that render layer, you have to create an override. And on the master layer, if you try to right click over a channel, like background texture, you'll see that there is no option to create an override because you can't override the master layer. So that is what the overriding means. You're overriding what the master is. So you can override nearly any channel inside of Maya. So for example, let's say for whatever reason, we had some backgrounds of something that only rendered in Arnold. I could right click over the vray rendered using, create an absolute override for the render engine, and then say, hey, I want to use Arnold for this render layer. Really, really cool to do that. I could also do something like on the Razor Crest. I could say, hey, I don't want the landing gear to show up on this render layer, but maybe I want to show it landing somewhere else. And because this is not rigged, it's static. If, let's say, I just wanted to get rid of it and maybe just like paint out that section in Photoshop to make it look like the landing gear was retracted, I could say, all right, so go to the shape node and then go to object display, and then I could override visibility. So I could right click over visibility, create an absolute override for it, and then uncheck it. So now it disappears here. But on the master layer, you can see the landing gear extended. So it's really, really useful. You can do all sorts of things with it. And it opens up a lot of opportunities to simplify the compositing process and also your animation process as well. So I really wish that this feature existed in 3ds Max because it doesn't. And there's third-party plugins that pretend to do something similar and they're just not as good. All right, so one thing that we did earlier, we go back to our render settings here. We created render elements. This is one specific thing I wanted to point out, that by default, render elements or render passes or AOVs, they carry across every single render layer. So on the master layer, this is where they were created. Every other layer references your master layer and just copies it. But the only layer that we actually want to have any of these passes on is the Razor Crest layer. But if we go to the clouds layer, we don't really need any of these passes there. And then on the sky, it's just wasting space to try to, render out GI, lighting and reflection and all of this because it's never going to be used. There's nothing useful there. So you can click on any one of these on any pass, and then you can go to extra vray attributes, and then you have what is the enabled or disabled. So if you click this changes from a yes to a no. If I click it here, they all change to no's. But this changes for every single render layer. So instead of what we're going to do on the Razor Crest layer itself, I'm going to select this layer, and we could either delete the passes and redo them. And by default, that would automatically create overrides for us on just the Razor Crest layer. Or we could manually override all of these passes right here so they don't show up on anything else. So I'll show you that way because it will allow me to show you something else as well. So on every one of these passes, we're going to select this under extra vray attributes, right click and create an override. And we don't actually need to change anything here. We just want to make sure that enabled is set. So this creates a whole bunch of AOV overrides for us. You can see that they're all enabled. So on something like this, like specular, I could disable it here, and you can see it disables here as well. So now what I can do on any layer that's not the Razor Crest layer, for example, our master layer, I can just click no, 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 no. And then if we go back to the Razor Crest layer, they're set to yes. If I collapse that, go to the clouds layer, they're set to no. And then on the sky layer, they're also set to no. That's really, really useful. Okay, so next I'm going to go back to our camera and I'm going to go to our Razor Crest layer right here. I'm going to unlock this just so I could, get a final view of something that I'm happy with. Something like this. And really, we probably would want to do that on the master layer. And we're going to have to start and stop that again, just so we can see the clouds. I think actually I want to make this a little bit higher up. So let's say that I'm satisfied with how this looks. All right, so now what we want to do is render out all three of these. So later on, I will go over how to set up what is called batch rendering, even though I think the majority of you are probably just going to use the PLE. If you are on campus, you can use batch rendering. And unfortunately, if you go to your rendering shelf, render sequenced render, it's not really going to do this properly. But we're only dealing with a still right now, so it's not very important. Okay, so it doesn't really matter which one you start on, but we don't need our master layer. We can just start on the Razor Crest. And I'm going to go back to render settings really fast. I'm going to change our resolution to HD 1080. So this is going to be full HD. The renderable camera does not mean anything in this case. It's only for when you're batching, and nothing else really matters for what we need. I did want to point out one thing that we are going to talk about this later. We are going to go under color mapping, and I'm going to disable color mapping just by going to mode, don't affect colors. I'll explain this in more depth, hopefully later on. We can also change the type to linear multiply. This also just basically means there's no tone mapping. So either one of these does it, but really do this just to be safe. Never clamp your output, by the way. Always leave that unchecked. And next I wanted to briefly show you the difference between progressive and bucket rendering. So progressive is what we use in IPR. So it does multiple small passes really quickly. So you can see your image very quickly. Bucket kind of does the opposite. So for bucket, I'm going to clear the image here so you can see this how it works. The bucket, by default, IPR is only going to use progressive. So to do bucket rendering, we actually have to click on this icon right here by default. But this, you're going to see all the different threads of your CPU and what each thread is working on in like this multicolored array of squares. So the reason why you would ever choose bucket over progressive is A, if you have very little memory, but honestly, that's probably not a very good use anymore because you usually will have enough memory. Bucket rendering does require less memory than progressive, but the main reason is progressive is dependent on your hardware where bucket is not. So progressive has a timeout feature by default, and bucket just has a noise threshold by default. So if you're rendering on a render farm and you have computers of all sorts, so you have really old ones, really new ones, well, the really new one is going to render really fast and the old one's going to take forever, but bucket ensures that they're all going to be the same. Like each image is going to be the same quality. Whereas by default with progressive rendering, you have what is your maximum render time limit. If it's 0, it means it can go forever, so it would do the same thing as bucket. But where progressive becomes very useful is if you are on lower end hardware or you just really want to kind of force your render to finish within a certain amount of time. You can say, I only want this render to take a maximum of 1 minute or 30 seconds. This is in minutes, by the way, so you have to use decimal points. Or you could do 15 seconds or something like that. to get really, really quick renders that are going to be very, very close to that amount of time. If you don't care, you can just say 0. And if you don't care with that, you may as well just use bucket rendering. But for this, we're going to say something like, I want this to be a maximum of 1 minute. So after a minute, it doesn't like suddenly stop. It just tries to hit that target instead of trying to hit just the noise threshold. So on bucket mode, you only have a noise threshold. And this is fine. You can go even lower than this. It will take a lot longer. So we're going to say progressive, 1 minute, and then we're going to render out each of these images. We're going to start with the Razor Crest and click render. So even though the IPR kind of makes it look like it's done really quickly, we can see it is actually still rendering. It is working on specific parts. Not sure exactly which parts it's working on. It's kind of hard to tell with progressive, where bucket's very, very clear what it's working on, but we just need to let this finish. So this is going to take probably about a minute to do, just because I said it could take a minute. So usually it's going to be around about whatever you set it to. Okay, so now that it is done, we're going to confirm that our passes are here. So they are here. And next, we're going to save this out. So we're going to make sure that you do save all image channels to a single file. And then this time, I'm going to say Razor Crest layer. Minimize that. Go to the clouds. And then the clouds are going to take the longest to render. And as you can see, this is really struggling to try to get this in under a minute. As you can see, this is going over a minute. If we had denoising enabled, this could be a lot faster, but we don't. So on the clouds, we're just gonna let it work. So I will explain this for projects and exercises, especially the next thing that we do, because it will be very apparent of why we're doing it. Whereas this is just kind of a lecture, which hopefully you guys are following along. If you're not, I think you will find the next assignment to be very tricky because I'm not going to explain everything again. Volumetrics actually take quite a long time to render. If you are trying to follow along though, and this is taking forever, what you can do is just lower your time even more. You can also go to bucket. So if I show you this, you can also try doing bucket and then doing a much higher threshold, like remove this 0 and just do 0.1. It's going to be much grainier, but much faster to render with bucket. You can try the same thing with progressive as well. You can lower the noise threshold, but I'm just going to let this render out so it's not super grainy. So if we scroll up to the top here, you can see this one took nearly 7 minutes to render. It doesn't necessarily mean that it will always be able to hit this goal. Now, what we probably should have done is lower the threshold, but it's just for an example, okay? So for this, it doesn't really matter if we want to do save current channel or save all channels because there's only one channel really. So we can click that. And then for the next one, this will be the fastest by far. Just select sky and then click render. So this one will be pretty much instantaneous. It does a little bit of stuff there, but is now ready. Then we can click this. Say sky layer, and now we can go back into After Effects. So we're going to set this all the way up again, just so we get the practice with doing this. So I'm going to open up the layers. So we get clouds layer, Razor Crest layer, and then our sky layer. This is not a typical convention for naming files like this, but we'll do that later. There's a specific way that we're going to do it inside of vray. And then I can actually just start with the sky layer there. And by default, it's going to be black because we have to right click over it, go to interpret footage, main, and then say, hey, we're ignoring the fact that there's an alpha there. We want that alpha. I'm going to maximize the view here. And then I'm going to grab cloud layer above the sky layer, and then the Razor Crest layer, like this. Hooray! So now we've got 3 separate things. And now we need to do our ACES color profile. So right click, new, adjustment layer. This kind of goes off the screen for you guys. Sorry. Pull it up. Adjustment layer. Open color. Usually it will be the last place you save this. Otherwise, go back to the vray frame buffer and grab the path there like we did earlier. Display, input space, scene linear, ACEScg, good to go on that. But then we need the color profile converter, sRGB, sRGB, linearize. All right, a lot of steps, but just get in the habit of doing it because it is what is required. I can call that ACES, I could call that OCIO, whatever. That's good. Okay, so now we have the same image that we had inside of Maya, but we have these separated into different parts, which is really, really cool. So if we'd be like, hey, the client decided that they don't want clouds anymore, we can just swap out the clouds. Or as you saw, the clouds took a really long time to render. So if you had to render everything together just to change the clouds, like if you look here, you'd be like, oh, hey, it's grainy. Great, now I need to re-render it or something. You could just re-render the clouds layer and it's completely separate. So it saves a lot of time. If you had everything in one layer and then you were like, hey, all right, so now we need to change the ship for some reason, or we needed the landing gear to be down in this sequence. All we have to do is re-render the ship render layer and then everything else is good. So the clouds that took, that could have easily taken 15, 20 minutes of frame to do a really high quality version at 4K. We don't have to do that. We only have to do that once and we can render as many different ships as we want to. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. This also allows us to do things like changing the color of the sky. So for this, I could grab what is called a lumetri color effect. And this is the only way in After Effects by default that you can get your color temperature. So on color temperature, we can do things like make the tones cooler, make the tones warmer. So that's kind of overkill on both there. But if I want to just give like a nice glow to the sky, I could do something like that. Or I could say, hey, it's supposed to be way darker. So in the lumetri color, we could also have curves here. And then I could say, hey, I just want to darken the sky down. Do something more like that. And let's get rid of some of the temperature there, so it's not so ridiculous. The horizon makes that kind of hard to use. We really want to hide that. We could even swap out the sky layer completely for something else. So like an HDR or something like that. Then for the Razor Crest layer, we do have all of those embedded AOVs or passes. We can grab our extractor effect and do the same thing that we did before. So here, we're going to grab GI, call that GI. This is going to be pretty much black here. There's like barely any bounce light just from itself from this angle. There will be lots of cases though where GI is like the most clear, but it's just because this is metal. We have lighting. Change this to lighting. Then we're going to add lighting. Again, you're not really going to see anything here just because of the fact that we're using metalness. So you still have to do it though, because there will be certain cases where you see like you can see here a very thin amount of highlight. And if I click on this button right here, you can kind of change the exposure. So really, there is quite a lot of detail there. You just can't see it from your current exposure. So it is important to include it because certain angles will see it. And if you do some crazy color correction, you will see it too. So this is just a quick view transform thing. I can click that again to make it go back to normal. And then here we can do reflection or reflect, whatever you want to call it. This is going to be the most prominent of them all. Duplicate this. Refraction. Grab our refract layer for the glass, which is going to be very, very pale right now. And then duplicate that one last time for specularity. All right, there we go. We have now composited the same thing that we just had, but now we have tons of control. You can change the sky independently from the clouds. They're completely independent too. So if I'm like, hey, I want the clouds to be a little bit brighter, boom, no problem. Or hey, I want the clouds to have more contrast. I want them to look darker. I can do that too. Like that. It's always better to have the ACES color profile on so you can see what you're doing more properly, but very easy to make changes like this. without having to go back and re-render. And then I could do things like, hey, I wanted to change the specularity, maybe completely get rid of it. I don't want it to be shiny. I mean, it's not physically accurate, but you could do something like that. Or you could say, hey, I'm going to click T for opacity, just lower the opacity here. Now, if you do lower the opacity past 100%, you can use what is called a linear dodge instead. Certain times you will see a difference, but they're very similar. So I can also do really cool stuff like create a new adjustment layer. This kind of goes off the screen for you guys again. I'll just do it up here. New adjustment layer. Put this underneath our ACES color management here. I can go to effects and presets, do exposure. And on the exposure, I can increase the exposure like this. And it's going to get a really, really filmic or how the camera would see the exposure. Is going to never completely clip. Like, yeah, that's really bad, it's blown out and everything, but the values here are never above 1. And that is what is so great about this profile right here. It is great. I could change this to untone mapped and it's going to, that's clipped. That's really bad. But the values here never go above 1, but this is still a clipped value. So the values that are around this highlight are still kind of maxed out at 1. So even though that it doesn't let you, it doesn't let those values go beyond 1, because beyond the sRGB 8-bit range, it's still clipped internally. So we always want to have that SDR video on. It's a really nice response. Anyway, I hope you guys found this lecture useful. We're going to be expanding upon this as we go throughout the course. And we're going to be hitting a lot of things that we've just talked about, but then actually doing something kind of more useful where we'll actually create an entire scene. So this was kind of leading up to an assignment. And then in the next videos, we're going to be creating that assignment. So we're basically going to do a landing sequence for the Razor Crest. So make sure that your Razor Crest is all ready to go with all of your textures and everything. If you have any other questions, I'm always happy to help. And I will see you all in the next lecture.